Hi guys. Oh, do you see? Do you see Pandita? Hi Pandita. Oh, she is. This is what she thinks of symbolic anthropology. How are you? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. So we talked about symbolic. We talked about symbols. We talked a little bit about culture and symbolism and symbolic anthropology and symbolic interpretation, right? A little bit more specifically in regards to language, but I have a little bit more to say because there's a little bit more you should know. All right, so I want to talk a little bit more about the types of symbols that anthropologists pay attention to, specifically in cultural anthropology, right? Because remember, like archaeology and cultural anthropology are connected in part because, I mean, they're both, well, they're two of the four fields, right? But they both or look to understand lifestyles, how groups interact with one another across time and space. They look at change, but cultural anthropology is looking at people who were alive generally, right? Archaeology tends to be looking at the past and focusing on material objects. So we're moving into cultural anthropology. I am a cultural anthropologist. This stuff is so cool. I don't want to leave anything out. All right, so while we talked about Geertz in our last video, and we did some reading on cocks and cockfighting, which I'm going to talk about later. Hold on. I have ghosts. Or in my family, sometimes we say, it's Elijah. Could be Elijah. So anyway, we talked about Geertz, right? I'm going to talk more about Geertz in a little bit, not in this video, cocks and cockfighting. But right now I'm going to talk about, I'm going to reference another symbolic anthropologist who came a little bit after Geertz. I really like her a lot too. Sherry Ortner. Building on his work, elaborating on his work, also very more concerned with issues of power, social justice, and structure versus the individual, right? And social change. I dig her. So anyway, Geertz saw culture as like a set or a collection of symbols, right? A symbol is something that represents something it is not. It's indicative of a relationship, and that relationship that we set up when we create symbols, right, has consequences. It helps us understand the culture. It also can help reinforce reinforce, reinvent, change cultural values and ideals. So anyway, Geertz looks at culture as a collection of symbols. Sherry Ortner is taking a more like interpretive. That's the approach she's taking. So it's going to be happening. I just put a plant in front of the door. This was probably not a good. I'm sorry. Anyway, all right, so as cultural anthropologists, what symbols do you even pay attention to, right? Question number one. Well, that's what we're going to talk about. So we have a couple different types of symbols that are important when we are looking to understand a culture or tell us things about a culture. The first kind I'm going to talk about, we have what are known as key symbols. And these key symbols, according to Ortner, are like the underlying, you can't see what I'm doing, I'm doing this. The underlying foundations of a culture, right? So how do we know like what the underlying foundations of a culture are and the symbols that represent them? Well, we can pay attention to two things. Anthropology is empirical. Remember, we start with data and then we have ideas. We don't start with ideas and then find data that supports those ideas, because that's just like, that's not science. So you might be an anthropologist who chooses to do research, right? Participant observation, perhaps. An ethnographic study. And after doing that research, working with people, learning about a culture, doing field work, you might just decide what those symbols are, right? So the symbols are what you, the anthropologist, think they are. That is known as a more etic approach, where we privilege the researcher's perspective, the perspective of the outsider, an etic approach, E-T-I-C. I mean, any guesses the other way we could decide or, figure out what symbols are the foundational and underlying important symbols for us to look at as anthropologists trying to understand a culture? I'm giving you time. Well, if it's not about what I think it is, then it's about what the people who are members of that culture think it is, right? So we just look at what people say is important to them, right? What do they think they are? That's known as an emic approach, E-M-I-C, one that privileges the perspectives and experiences of the insider or the cultural participant, right? And so like in good cultural anthropology, we have sort of a balance of both, right? There's a tension between the two. You need, an emic approach shows meaning and perhaps gives like a more accurate representation that like isn't filtered through, even anthropologists are culturally or can be ethnocentric, right? So like isn't filtered through the lens of an outsider. However, in order to like do comparative research and start to look at these larger questions of what makes us uniquely human, how are we all like similar, how are we different, what are like the cultural universals, the needs that we all seek to have met, right? By organizing ourselves in societies with sort of expectations, scripted expectations for behavior. They're not just like innate and biological. I don't know what I was saying. I think it was deep though. Oh yeah, bigger questions. We have to be able to do comparative work, which means sometimes we have to decide as anthropologists how to categorize, right, specific and different things, unique things practices, behaviors, cultures and ideas in ways that allow us to compare. And when we're doing this with symbols, we tend to do it one of two ways. You either start with the cultural phenomena, right? And then look at the specific cultural phenomena, and then look at various ways that it is symbolically represented, or symbols that are associated with it in a variety of different cultures or at different times, because anthropology is comparative always across time and across space. So we look at how things change, and then we also look at how collectives or groups do things similarly and yet differently. Or you can start with a symbol, right? And look at the various meanings that it has for different people in different places at different times, and in different contexts. Okay. Now, we know about symbols in like writing and poetry, right? But like symbols in like cultural symbols are a little bit harder. They're not always like metaphors or similes, but okay. And also we like take them. Okay. So how do we know? How do we find them? What do they look like? Here we go. So key symbols. We have private symbols and we have public symbols, right? So like a private symbol and private symbol. Oh, here we go. This. Should I do this? Like it's a makeup tutorial? It doesn't really help. This is an air plant, right? This air plant, it's like nature, it grows, whatever, I don't know, it's a plant, it's vegetation. That's what it is. What it represents to me, or the meaning that I give it, is like much greater. It was a holiday present from my two best friends, Alex and Leah. Hey, Alex and Leah. Thanks, guys. Your present's coming for Juneteenth. I mean, your Christmas presents are, it's like, I don't know what's the next holiday. But it was, what did they say? They included a note with it. So it was on a crystal. So it's still, I keep it with crystals. But and it was from this Christmas. And it said, something about life, like continuing, right? Like growth continuing, surviving, even if we're not thriving, whatever. So it was a Christmas present during a pandemic from two of my friends, and it means a lot to me. It's not just a plan, like, right? It's special. I dropped it. I felt bad. That's a private symbol. Sherry Ortner and symbolic anthropology generally, as a cultural anthropologist, remember, cultural anthropology is like, looks at groups, right? So that's one of the ways it's different than sociology, large industrialized societies, psychology, smaller individual, right? Generally. Anthropology looks at groups and how groups interact with one another in the world around them. So Ortner's not interested in private symbols. She's interested in public symbols. We need not like the meaning of the necklace that your grandmother gave you or my air plant. But we're looking for the symbols that, as a group or as a collective, we present to one another and to the world, right? And so they're kind of easy to see, or they're easier than like, how would you know that my air plant is important? You would have to talk to me for a long time. These are things like a flag, a cross, a Star of David, perhaps specific like modes of dress, right? Symbols that are presented publicly, both as a collective representation, but also for the public. Now, just because we like have these foundational public underlying symbols, these key symbols, right, doesn't mean that like everything's all harmonious and we all agree. First of all, there's not just one, there can be tons. Just be like, culture is also leveled. So, you know, there are, we share, whatever. We share a culture because we're in Kingsborough. We share a Brooklyn culture, an American culture, you know, on some levels, a world culture. But in other aspects, we, you know, are all part of various and different cultural groups that we are a part of, and we know that not everyone else is. I mean, the boundaries can be like messy, but that's the general idea, right? So there can be lots of different symbols, public symbols. Also, conflict. Not everybody has to agree. And we know that. As like you and me living in the world right now and having done the reading from last week, we know that there are lots of symbols that are public that are foundational and underlying that we don't all agree on what they represent. So, that can show us, I mean, that's something interesting to look at in and of itself, right? Is when things cause conflict, when there is disagreement over meaning, right? Where does that come from? And what does that tell us about power, structure, positionality, right? How power operates in ways that we might not always be aware of in, you know, in a group. Also people's experiences, things like that. Now, we were talking about key symbols. Let's talk about another kind of symbol, summarizing symbols. So for summarizing symbols, it helps to think of like powerful emotions, okay? Those are our feeling symbols. So summarizing symbols sum up a powerful emotional experience of a larger sort of, that relates to a larger whole. So think things like the flag, right? An object that represents so much more to so many people. And I mean, if we look at, you know, current events and how the flag is brought into the conversation, right? We can see that powerful summarizing emotional capacity. Another one might be the cross, right? Your feelings about the cross are not just, and the symbol of the cross is not just about the cross, it's about the religion as a whole, right? Faith, or, you know, your system of beliefs. The Virgin Mary is another one, right? So these are symbols that elicit strong feelings that are about way more than just one single object, one single image, or one single practice. Those are summarizing symbols. So we have key symbols, we have summarizing symbols, we have elaborating symbols. That's a word that you will have read in comments that I write to you a lot. Elaborate, expand, give me more details. So what do you think elaborating symbols do? Well, elaborating symbols are good to think with. Says an anthropologist. I will find his name and include it later. But symbols that are good to think with, right? Not feeling symbols necessarily, like summarizing symbols. So elaborating symbols are about thinking. So an elaborating symbol sort of like it gives meaning or tells us more about a process and encourages us to think more deeply about a role, a scenario, or a situation in life. So things like when we talk about, I actually don't ever say this, but cricket or baseball being a metaphor for life, right? You can expand on that, and it helps you understand a huge variety of situations that you may choose to be in, you may be placed in, right? By using this metaphorical relationship between a sporting event and your own or a group's personal experience, it helps us think and understand the world in which we live. Or we might talk about man the machine. You know, what are we saying then about our lives, our place in the world? Even like we talk about something like the war on drugs. The war on drugs, right, sets up a relationship between an epidemic, right, of addiction and maybe not even an epidemic of addiction, maybe just like drugs themselves, substances, and a battle that we fight as a nation to defend our country. So what does that tell us when we set up that relationship? What does that tell us about how we should go forth in addressing the situation, right? When we say stuff like the war on drugs, it's like, I mean, then when people have addiction problems or are suffering from an addiction, to extend that metaphor, I mean, we see them as enemy combatants, right? I don't know, something about. Now, these elaborating symbols, they're pretty important because they provide categories for understanding the world, right? For understanding new situations, new events, by likening them to things we're familiar with and doing this on a collective level. It helps us, place our reality into boxes and create order and structure in our world. So we might call these root metaphors. So relationships that we set up that sort of underlie how we see events and scenarios and how we see the future develop. Now, the last type of symbol we're going to talk about, key scenarios. And this is interesting because we don't always think about this as a symbol. So key scenarios, these tend to be stories, myths. They could be rituals and reenactments. But they provide strategies and possibilities for action in our lives. They give us a particular vision of success. Now, again, we can hold multiple symbols and have multiple meanings, right, in our mind. But we need to be aware of the fact that, like, the symbol is the symbol, and it is not actually reality. So key scenarios also sort of show us the best way to achieve success in our life. So examples of key scenarios, right? How do you make it big in the US? How do you become successful? Work hard, you get a lot of money. pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. I mean, what does that mean? You don't need help, right? It's about the individual. You shouldn't need assistance. Anybody can do it, right? And it's all about like climbing that ladder to like get a good job or something. I don't know, and that's going to make you successful and respected. It might. That might be the way to go about it. But there are other stories of success that we tell in other contexts, right? Maybe the successful person is the person who has many grandchildren, you know, and you love them and take care of them in their old age. If that is sort of the story or the goal, right, the metaphor that circulates within a society, that stresses a different set of values than this like work hard, get a good job, you know, be able to make a lot of money to buy the clothes and the cars that you want and not need help from anyone. Things to think about. So, I mean, these are like, there's nothing, this is just sort of how different anthropologists break down this large topic of symbols, which can be sort of like amorphous and like, well, I don't know, I know what they are, but how do I know them when I see them? Well, look for these things. Look for things that serve these functions, right? And you will be on your way. All right. That's all I got to say, guys. Do good. Be well. Peace out. Later.